Good afternoon to those of you just joining us. We're just getting ready for our afternoon session. We've got about 100 people online already, and we'll be starting in just about 7 minutes. See you then. Good afternoon if you're just joining us. We're just getting ready for this fifth BTO conference session. We'll be making a start in about 5 minutes. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 5th session of our BTO virtual conference. My name is Ian Evans, and I'm BTO's Director of Engagement, and I'll be your host this afternoon, most of which I'm pleased to say we're going to be spending in the garden, or at least looking at garden birds. I hope that those of you who've already joined sessions this week have been enjoying the conference as much as I have. We're really sorry that the pandemic means we can't get together in person this year. But I hope that but the fact that we're doing this virtually does mean that many of you who wouldn't normally be able to join us can do so virtually. It's exciting to see we've got approaching 300 people connected now, and more people watching on our live YouTube and Facebook streams. This is more than we could have hoped to have fitted into our conference centre at Swanwick, and it's fantastic to know that we're reaching so many more people through these means. I was just having a look at the attendee list. Actually, it's really nice to see lots of familiar faces in there, but it's also lovely to be welcoming new friends too. So whether you are a regular conference attendee or a first timer, a very warm welcome to you all. We've got 3 fantastic talks lined up for you this afternoon with speakers in Norfolk, London, and even from Ithaca, New York. At the end of each session, we'll have a short time for questions, and you'll see at the bottom of your screen the Q&A function, and you can put your questions into that section, and we'll pick through them at the end. While you're in there typing in your question, if you see a question that you would also like to know the answer to, just give it a thumbs up, and that'll push it up the charts and raise its prominence so that we can be sure to answer it. We've organised 14 free talks this week and 2 panel discussions, all of which have been free for people to attend. And we've only been able to do that thanks to the generous support of members. So a huge thank you to all of you members who've joined us today. You know, income that we get from subscriptions, from membership and Garden Birdwatch, and from donations make up nearly half of all of our charitable income. And it's so really important to us, particularly at that time. Without this income, as you know, BTO just wouldn't be the organisation that it is today. It's a tough time for us, as it is for so many people. For charities like ours, the future is uncertain and our income is suffering. So at this time, your support is appreciated more than ever. If you're in a position to make a donation, and you can do so today, then you can do it by following the link that's on the screen now. Also, if you enjoy the talks and you're not already a member, we'd love to welcome you as a BTO member. So have a look on the website and you'll find the join links there. Our members are really our lifeblood, and it's through membership that you can support the work that we do to inspire and educate people and to advance our understanding of birds and monitoring and through research. So a very warm welcome. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to introduce our first speaker now, which is my colleague Kate Risley. Kate's the Garden Birdwatch organiser, and she's going to reveal some of the fascinating findings from 25 years of Garden Birdwatch. Over to you, Kate.
Thanks very much, Ian. I hope you can now see my screen and hear me as well. I can't see anyone at all, so I'm hoping that everything is going well, but I'm sure somebody will tell me if it isn't. Great, I've just had a message, thanks. So thank you very much to everyone for tuning in. And also it's a real shame, as Ian said, that we can't all see each other in person. I always enjoy the BTO conference, so it's a real shame that I can't be there this year to see all of you, but this is the next best thing. So my name's Kate Risley. I have been the Garden Birdwatch organiser at BTO for the last 6 years, and I have worked for the BTO in other roles for about the last 16 years. So I've been involved in Garden Birdwatch, or known about Garden Birdwatch, for quite a long time now, but obviously not as long as it's actually been running. The survey has been running for 25 years this year, which is pretty amazing. So What I'm going to do today in the next 20 minutes or so is just cover, first of all, what is the BTO Garden Birdwatch? What is the survey? How do people do it? Hopefully, a lot of you, if you don't already do it, will decide that you want to following this talk. And talk about the scale of the data that we've collected over the last 25 years. Talk about a few of the changes that we've seen in our gardens over 25 years. And a little bit about the research that has been done using Garden Birdwatch data. I'm not going to cover everything, but I will give a bit of a flavour of the main themes. And then it's an exciting time for Garden Birdwatch at the moment, so I'm going to talk a bit about where we hope to go in the future. So first of all, hopefully a lot of you listening will know what Garden Birdwatch is, but if you don't, all you need to do to take part, all we ask people to do is make a list of the birds seen in their garden every week. And that's it, really simple. Anyone can take part who's got any kind of an outdoor space, normally a garden, obviously, but you know, a sort of a balcony or a patio or anywhere where birds may visit people can take part in the survey. And in fact, we're really interested in how birds use these spaces that maybe aren't, you know, traditionally good gardens for birds. We don't have a specific, a very strict way of recording for Garden Birdwatch. We don't say in terms of when you have to record, but we do ask people to be very consistent in how they record and how long they spend to make their list of birds in their garden every week. So, for example, some people might just record all the birds that they see throughout the whole week, if they're at home all week. Or other people might decide just to spend, you know, if they're normally at home on a Saturday morning, they will sort of pay attention to the feeders every Saturday morning. But the whole point is that the list that is made has to be representative of the birds that are in the garden, and any changes should be picked up by these lists that are made. So essentially it's important to be consistent so that any changes reflect what's happening with the birds rather than what's happening with the observer's activity. Participants can just record the presence of what species of birds are in their garden, or can record a maximum count of the birds seen together at any one time. Obviously, and that's about the minimum that needs to be done. It's really simple to take part, very easy to fit around your life. But when people are looking at their gardens, we have thousands of people watching their gardens, and this is a great opportunity to gather other information, which I'll talk about a bit later on. But we do allow participants to record other wildlife. So mammals, reptiles, amphibians, butterflies, dragonflies, and bumblebees. Can all be recorded for Garden Birdwatch as well. And most importantly, we ask people to record the habitat of the garden, what kind of garden it is, the habitat around the garden, and what food is put out. So that's how to take part in the survey. And we currently have about 20,000 people all over the UK who are taking part in Garden Birdwatch. So just to talk a little bit about why, what we're actually interested in, because it's easy to think that Garden Birdwatch is about just trying to count the numbers of birds that are there living in gardens and whether they're going up or whether they're going down, which it is. But birds don't live in gardens all year round. Gardens are a resource that birds will visit from other places normally. And there's a few species, you know, your house sparrows, for example, that might live in your garden all year round, but most birds live somewhere else. And whenever they come to your garden, they're coming to use something that's in your garden specifically that they need at that time. And this might be somewhere to nest, or it might be water, or just a kind of a bit of structure in the surrounding landscape. But most often, of course, it's food, which could be insects, it could be seeds, but most commonly, of course, it's the food that we put out in our bird feeders, which is a really significant source of nutrients and energy for bird populations, more so than we thought it was, I think, once we realized actually how much is being put into gardens. So really what Garden Birdwatch is, it's not about finding out numbers of birds that happen to be in gardens, it's about working out how we can make our gardens help wildlife as much as possible by providing what the different species need at the right time of year, by finding out what do the birds need at different times of year, why are they coming into gardens. So just as an example of that, this is the kind of data we get from Garden Birdwatch. Very important that it's all year round. Not many surveys are carried out throughout the whole year. And this graph might look a bit complicated at first, but it's really simple. If you look at the red line, for example, all this is, it shows the average number of long-tailed tits in Garden Birdwatch gardens throughout the year. So starting in January on the left-hand side and going all the way through to December. And this is just the average count. Every point on this line is a week, so 52 weeks throughout the year, and it's the total number of long-tailed tits recorded in that week across Garden Birdwatch divided by the number of gardens. Very simple. And what you can see is that in the start of the year, in January, February, quite high numbers of long-tailed tits in gardens, but they very quickly leave at the start of their breeding season, which is quite early. And by the time you get to April and May, they've all left, gardens hardly ever seen. And then after the breeding season, they come back in. And then when you get to the autumn, numbers are high in gardens again, and then they really pick up in the winter, November and December, which is when it gets cold. So that's 1 year, the red line, and every single other line is a different year, all 25 years of Garden Birdwatch, all laid on top of each other. So that's what the graph is showing. And there are two things to take from this, really. One is that long-tailed tits are using resources in gardens very differently at different times of year. So in the breeding season, they don't need what we can provide in gardens. That's not what they need for breeding. We could put as much food for long-tailed tits in our gardens in April and May, and it wouldn't benefit them because they're not coming into our gardens at that time of year. Whereas in the winter, when it gets cold, small-bodied birds like long-tailed tits do need, they need a lot of energy. So they'll come in to use our bird feeders. So you can really see that that's what they need in the cold times of year. And the other thing to take from this is that there's a lot of variation between years. So some years numbers might be high, some years the following year numbers might be lower in the winter, and that tells us a bit about the kind of the wider conditions in the wider countryside, so weather conditions, for example. And it shows how they'll come into gardens to use garden resources at a time when food resources are scarce elsewhere. So that's really the kind of information we can get from Garden Birdwatch data, and you can see how this year-round recording is really important. So I'll talk a little bit about the scale of the data we've collected from Garden Birdwatch. So all these small green dots on this map are the every single Garden Birdwatch garden that's ever been registered for the survey. And the larger dots are the ones where people have signed up for Garden Birdwatch on the 1st of January 1995, and they've been recording ever since then for the last 25 years and are still recording today. So an incredible commitment. And these numbers show there's 56,000 of the smaller dots, 56,000 gardens ever registered, and there are 250 of the larger dots of the people who've been recording throughout the whole time period, which is just incredible. And we're so grateful to everyone who's taken part, whether it's for 25 years or people who've just started. 25 years of recording would be 1,304 weeks, and the most lists from a single garden is 1,300, which is just incredible. In total, we've had nearly 9 million lists submitted to Garden Birdwatch over the years, 387 species, not just birds, of course, and the total number of records on our database is 194 million. So an incredible resource that is useful now and will be used for research a long time into the future. We've recorded 42 million filled up bird feeders, and we've had 160,000 incidents of garden wildlife disease, which is something we've started looking at recently. It's a less positive thing to mention, but we're realizing how important this is and how important gardens are to be able to monitor this. So just to talk a little bit about a few things that have changed over the last 25 years, I'm going to just highlight a few species that have increased and declined, but these graphs are on the Garden Birdwatch website, so if anyone wants to go and explore these, then please do. So goldfinches are one that we've obviously seen increase in gardens. You can see this graph, you can see that sort of annual pattern that I showed on the single year repeated every year. Every single species has got a pattern, sort of an increase and a sort of high and a low point in any year. But this graph shows the entire 25-year period of the survey. So starting in 1995, when there were about 10 to 20% of gardens recorded goldfinches, and now it's up to sort of 3/4 of gardens. And we think this is to do with the kinds of foods that we're putting in gardens and how we have changed the kind of food that we put out, much more seeds, different kinds of seeds, and not so much of things like fats and peanuts, which these seeds suit goldfinches a lot more. So nuthatches have also shown an increase. Positive story, mainly to do with an increase in range. Not many corvids have actually really changed their percentages in gardens over the years, but jackdaws are definitely one that has shown a slight increase in that time. And obviously wood pigeons are definitely something that we're seeing in more gardens now than we were 25 years ago. And they're not leaving at certain times of year, which they used to do. They're sort of staying in gardens all year round. A few less positive stories. Greenfinches have obviously shown a national population decline and also a decline in gardens. And we know this is due to their decline in population caused by trichomonasis, a disease. Chaffinches, you can see from this graph, it's more subtle, but you can see that the rates have started to decline in the last sort of 5 years or so, which is something that we are very interested in now. House sparrow, obviously, we've seen a decline historically, but you can also see that numbers have leveled off in the last 6 or 7 years, and we're not seeing a continued decline, which is obviously good news. And one that we talk about a little bit is song thrush. Song thrush is actually nationally, the breeding bird survey population trends is holding up. So it's an interesting pattern to see that they are continuing to decline in gardens, whereas they're not in the wider countryside. Again, this is not something we really know about yet, about why this might be, but it's something that it just shows why it's valuable to look at what's happening in gardens as well as what's happening in the wider countryside to try and pinpoint causes of change. So that covers a few things that we've seen, and now to cover some of the research that has been done using Garden Birdwatch data. So in a later session today, Benjamin van Doren is going to talk about some of the research that's been done into wintering blackcaps. But this is just to say that Garden Birdwatch data has been used to really pinpoint the fact that the wintering blackcaps in the UK have really been driven, that change has been driven by the artificial food. So food in gardens, as well as obviously a warming winter climate, has made it possible for blackcaps to overwinter here when they didn't used to. And we've found that out using Garden Birdwatch data. Another piece of work that's been done using, this is actually data from the Garden Bird Feeding Survey, which is associated with Garden Birdwatch, is work done by Kate Plummer. The previous work on blackcaps and Garden Birdwatch data was also done by Dr. Kate Plummer at the BTO. And this has shown that over since the 1970s, the diversity of birds that use our garden feeders has been increasing, which has been put down to the diversification of the different foods that we put out in gardens. And the species that use feeders more and that have started to use garden bird feeders are also the ones that have shown increases in populations. And obviously, that could go both ways. We could be seeing more of them at feeders because there are more of them in the wider countryside. But just looking specifically at urban habitats and human habitats, it does appear that the ones that don't use feeders aren't doing so well, and the ones that do use feeders are showing population increases. So it seems to be something happening there. This is talking a little bit about some things that we're just starting to do. And so we do collect information on other garden wildlife through Garden Birdwatch. We are just starting to, a PhD is starting. This is Becki Turner, who's starting her PhD at CH. This isn't a British picture or a British species, but Becki is starting a PhD on population processes in amphibians and reptiles, and the Garden Birdwatch data set is going to be a really important part of this research. And along similar lines, a few years ago, my colleague, Dr. Doren, finished a manuscript looking at butterfly population trends in butterflies using Garden Birdwatch data, which really tells us more about how populations of these other wildlife are changing in gardens and how this might differ from the wider countryside, and what this can tell us about what's affecting these changes. Again, I'm not going to talk too much about the research we've done into health and disease, because Dr. Becki Lawson is going to follow me to talk about this in more detail. But one of the most interesting things that has been done with Garden Birdwatch over the last few years is the partnership with ZSL and other organisations to the Garden Wildlife Health Partnership. And this allows people in Garden Birdwatch gardens to report any signs of sickness or disease in their garden wildlife. We know how important this is through the work that's been done on green finches and trichomonasis. And this allows us to investigate how disease is transmitted in gardens and what effect it might have on bird populations. So this has really led to a recent increased focus on the disease transmission risk of bird feeding, as well as the benefits, obviously, that we talked about earlier, and how, for example, best practice and hygiene in cleaning bird feeders is a really important message for us to get out. And just the focus on how, and the understanding of how wildlife disease might be affecting national populations. So I'm coming to the end of my time, and so I'm just going to quickly talk about a few of the exciting things that we want to be doing in future with Garden Birdwatch data. So one of the research priorities, strategic research priorities for the BTO, is the consequences for biodiversity and urbanisation and infrastructure development. And obviously, Garden Birdwatch does give us the potential for studies of garden and urban design, and how we could best build and how we could build our urban areas, and how we can structure our gardens to be of the most benefit for wildlife, just in respect of things like corridors. Another area of interest that my colleague, Dr. Hugh Hammer, has been working on recently is the effects of garden resources on wider populations. So, for example, how does nutrients in the form of the food we put in bird feeders in urban areas flow out to the wider countryside when birds move and then maybe breed in other areas? So how is our food helping populations elsewhere? And something that we're working on at the moment are new methods for generating robust population trends from Garden Birdwatch. And we're doing some of this work using funds from the recent chaffinch appeal, because one of the things we need to know in order to look at chaffinch population trends is really understanding how those are different in urban areas compared to other, the wider countryside. So just a quote here from one of my colleagues, Dr. Gavin Wardner. Garden Birdwatch has massive potential. Our only national data on gardens, and our currently some of our only data on terrestrial birds in winter. Obviously, we do have the ringing scheme as well, but in terms of gardens and just understanding the different factors that are affecting our populations from different areas. Garden birdwatch is so important. So just to mention that, as a lot of you will be aware, Garden Birdwatch is, and in the past was, only run as a membership. So people would pay £17 a year to be a member of Garden Birdwatch and take part in the survey that way. During lockdown, and as a way to make Garden Birdwatch available to more people, we made it free. It's going to remain free to take part as a survey, but we are going to make it possible for people to still subscribe to Garden Birdwatch and support our research through membership subscriptions, through BTO membership, and sort of get the magazine, the Garden Birdwatch magazine, Bird Table, in that way. And we've been doing a lot of work this year. It's been a very busy year for us, supporting all the people who've joined Garden Birdwatch this year. We have a weekly e-news by my colleagues in the Garden Birdwatch team, and we're just reaching so many more people, which is just amazing. But it's a time of change for Garden Birdwatch, and we really hope we can continue to make it as successful as it has been, and expand it, and expand the research that we're doing with this slightly different funding model through subscriptions and donations rather than purely through subscriptions. So thank you. I think that's about my time, and I wanted to just thank particularly everyone who takes part in Garden Birdwatch and everyone who's been involved in the survey over the past 25 years. And I've got a few minutes for any questions.
Brilliant, Kate. Thanks so much for that. That was a great talk. We've got loads of questions, so I'm going to challenge you to answer the first couple in one or fewer words. The first one is a common one, I know. Should people who take part in Garden Birdwatch be counting birds that fly over their garden?
No. Easy answer. So basically, Garden Birdwatch is about birds that are using the garden. So we do say that Garden Birdwatchers should define their garden, and any bird that is within the garden using it in some way, and that might include birds that, you know, if you've got a pond and a swallow flies down low of the pond to take an insect, that bird is using your garden. But a gull that happens to fly over, you know, really high ahead and doesn't even know your garden's there, that's not using your garden. So it's about birds that are using your garden. They're the ones that should be recorded. Obviously, we have bird track. So any birds that you see from your garden can be recorded in bird track.
Perfect, thank you. Another quick one. Do you share the butterfly records with Butterfly Conservation? Yes,
we have done in the past. It's been on a slightly ad hoc basis, depending on when they need it, you know, for their atlas records, for example. But basically, yes, we do share, you know, there's quite a few things that I didn't mention, but we do share data with other organisations as widely as we can. And actually, the butterfly trend work that we did was in partnership with Butterfly Conservation.
Great, thank you. There's a really popular question here from Pete Edwards, who asks, who says that there's been discussions about the health benefits or not to birds of fat balls. Have you got any comments on evidence for or against the benefits of fat balls?
Yeah, so Kate Plummer did do some research a few years ago on, the different kinds of diets that birds have and how that affects their fitness. I don't know if I can give a really short answer. It's a very complicated answer to a complicated question. There isn't a straight yes or no, it's good or bad. But I would say that Kate Plummer has written a blog that's on the BTO website about should we feed garden birds. So I would refer people to read that blog.
Great, perfect. And our old friend Frank Morby, he's on wondering about the effect of wild bird food crops in the countryside and whether it affects the birds that are using his garden. Are we doing any work on the movement of birds between gardens and the countryside, for example?
Yeah, so that's exactly one of the things that I know that Gavin's team has been working on in the past. We know that wild bird food or that bird food in the wider countryside and farmland does run out at certain times of year in late winter, and that's when we do tend to see a peak of things like reed buntings and yellowhammers coming into gardens to use those food supplies, because we know that those foods have run out in the countryside. So yes, they will preferentially use food in the countryside and then come into gardens. And yeah, that is a really big area of interest, how birds move from one habitat to another, and it's a part of ongoing research.
Fantastic. A couple more quick ones then. Any sign of the green finch population recovering?
Not recovering, no. Every year we think, is it flattening off a little bit? I think it might be starting to at least level off, yes. But no, we're not seeing any signs of recovery. I would say that obviously it's very regional. So in some areas we might have a bit of a recovery, whereas nationally, no.
And last one. Some people have a problem of rats in their gardens. How do they stop them climbing up the poles to get to their feeders?
I really sympathise. I have rats in my garden as well, chickens. And there are various things you can try. I would say that if you have, people don't like to stop feeding because they think that if you stop putting out bird food, the birds will suffer. What we know is that if you stop putting out birds in your garden, stop putting out food in your garden for a short amount of time, the birds don't forget how to forage naturally. They don't, they won't starve to death. They will just go somewhere else, and they will come back when you start feeding again. So we're really clear that it's fine to stop feeding for a little while if you need to. For example, if you've had a disease outbreak, or if you've got a real rat problem and you need to sort of tackle that by reducing food supplies. And obviously you need to do other things like clear out where they might be nesting, clear out your outbuildings, that kind of thing. But yeah, to be honest, I think if it's got to that point, then taking the food supply away for a little bit is really sort of what you need to do.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Kate. I think we could have dedicated a whole session to questions and answers about garden birds. So thanks very much. That's been brilliant. We're going to move on to our next speaker now.
Feel free to ask me on Twitter if you've got any other questions.
Thank you. So we're going to stay in the garden now, and we're going to look at what garden bird watchers have taught us about garden wildlife health. And joining us to talk about her work on this subject is Dr. Becki Lawson. Becki's a vet at ZSL, and hopefully she's going to come online now and tell us all about her work. Becki, over to you.
Okay, so hi, hopefully you can hear me as the first step, and I'll now try and share screen and go to the talk. So bear with me. How's that looking? Okay, all right. Well, I can't hear anybody else now, so I'm going to hope that everything's running to plan. I'm just checking messages, and it seems that we are fine. So that's absolutely great. I'm going to make a start. Yes, thank you so much for the invitation to get involved in the online conference. I'm a vet at the Zoological Society of London, and I'm going to talk a little bit about garden wildlife health. And I think hopefully this picks up really nicely after Kate's presentation, because there's a few shared topics. And in particular, I hope there are many garden bird watchers out there listening today, because I want to take the opportunity to highlight the lessons that we've been able to learn with garden bird watchers' input, some of whom have been reporting to us on the garden bird health aspects for approaching 15 years now. So BTO's remit is to understand how and why bird populations vary. At ZSL, we're a conservation charity for species and habitats, but have a particular interest in wildlife health. So my primary goal is to understand the impact of disease on wildlife populations. And I think we're well aware of all sorts of important factors relating to habitat and food availability, climate change, exploitation of species, all of these sorts of threats, but perhaps it's still under-recognized that the role that disease can play as a driver of population change. And if we look back, there are some very well-known examples that spring to mind if we go back to the 50s, 60s of toxic pollutants, the organochlorines, and the effects that they had on bird of prey populations. So we're aware of the magnitude of those effects. And more recently, a licensed drug that was inadvertently found to be toxic to vulture populations in India and Nepal. And there were collapse of the vulture populations in the late 1990s as a consequence of this. So a very dramatic disease impact. But also infectious disease can be an important impact on wild bird populations. And if we look to North America from the 90s, there's an example from scientists at Cornell investigating this bacterial infection that caused conjunctivitis, in particular affecting house finches and leading to large scale and sustained population declines in that species. So my role is to conduct wildlife disease surveillance, and I believe that the information that we can collect helps us address potentially a number of goals. So if we understand, if it's appropriate, how to mitigate a disease or perhaps to prevent its incursion, then we may be able to conserve biodiversity. If we understand wildlife populations as a potential source of infections that might cause ill health in people or livestock, we may be able to limit that transmission and in so doing, safeguard public and captive animal health. If we understand how human activity can influence the occurrence of conditions in wildlife, we may be able to change the way that we manage habitats to optimize wild animal welfare. And also through these investigations, we can document, and in so doing, I think, hopefully help prevent wildlife crime. And within the context of this, I'm thinking about raptor persecution cases, for example. So at a BTO conference, I don't need to explain what we need by citizen science, but I just want to highlight that, to my mind, I think this is really beneficial, hopefully, to both the citizens and the scientists. Yes, there's all of the contribution and involvement with science and connection with nature, but in this project, there's an ability to access information on current threats and how to optimize habitat management for wildlife health and welfare. From our point of view, if it wasn't, oh dear. Apologies for that. I hope that the screen looks normal to you. It just froze to me. I'm going to carry on and say that from our point of view, if it wasn't for people's help, there was no way we could undertake surveillance across the country and throughout the calendar year. So as Kate's touched on, in Britain, in many countries, there's a real enthusiasm for provision of supplementary food for garden birds with many benefits. And this is often practiced year round and sometimes on a large scale. But coming with that is a potential risk of disease transmission. And I'm going to come back to that point again later. But because we have these environments where we can see our garden birds in close proximity, the situation lends itself to adding in disease surveillance as part of our monitoring of these wild birds. This work actually started at ZSL in the early 1990s, but I'm going to fast forward and start the story briefly in 2005 when BTO Garden Birdwatchers first became involved. And that was with the launch of the Garden Bird Health Initiative. So the first thing to highlight is that it's a team effort. So BTO and RSPB are partners on this work, and we work with a number of different labs, with government, with industry, and we rely on help from the public to do this. And in the early years, we used two independent but complementary means of surveillance. So first, any member of the public who saw sick or found a dead garden bird in their local area could get in contact with us and make that report. And that was typically by telephone to the RSPB Wildlife Inquiries Unit. And that meant that we could get a wealth of information, but we had no control over observer effort in time and space. And so we combined this with systematic surveillance, which was only possible because of the BTO's Garden Birdwatch network. And what we did was recruit around 1,000 people in the early years and ask them not only to provide this detailed information on the birds that they see in their garden, but also to let us know whether or not they saw signs of ill health. And that negative sightings data set is tremendously helpful in enabling us to have a control data set which we can use for much more robust analysis. So at that time, we were sending out hard copy forms in the post, we were scanning them in, we were transcribing telephone questionnaires into Excel documents. So it was very time consuming. So we were delighted in 2013 when we were able to move to online reporting with the Garden Wildlife Health website. We continue to work with BTO and RSPB, but also partner with FrogLife. And we combined the bird with also hedgehog, reptile and amphibian disease surveillance, so a wider garden health perspective. So the systematic disease reporting continues, and I'm hoping to many of you, this will be a familiar slide. It's a screen grab from the Garden Birdwatch system, but I just want to highlight that each week when you're giving your reports, the health tab, hopefully the animals that you see most of the time will be fit and well. But by taking the time to check this box to tell us you hadn't seen any signs of ill health, that alone gives us really valuable information. So thank you so very much for doing that. And then in the event that you do unfortunately see signs of what you think it may be ill health, we obviously want to find out the species that are involved, the numbers of animals. And in the event that you may have found a freshly dead wild bird, that you might be willing to speak to one of our 2 project vets about if it may be possible to arrange submission for postmortem examination. We ask you to give a telephone contact. Obviously, it's important we can discuss that in detail and quickly to decide if and how to proceed. But online, you can also give details of what you've spotted. There's a free text section. And through changes in the website, we now have the option to take you directly to our website where you can upload photos. And these, as the vets who check these reports, can be tremendously helpful. A very simplistic example is photos that enable us, for example, to contrast a tick with an avian pox lesion. Sometimes the photos are only helpful in as much as they clearly, as with this blue tit, we've got fluffed up plumage, non-specific signs of systemic ill health, but no specific indication of what the cause of ill health would be, and that requires further investigation. And then the opportunistic reporting continues, so wider public can come to us via the Garden Wildlife Health website. It's all free to participate, and actually it really doesn't need to be a garden. It can be any location, and make the reports of their observations in that way. Okay, so through both of these routes, for a subset of reports, we try to conduct post-mortem examinations on these wild animals. Important to emphasize just briefly that every submission is under veterinary direction, so we always have to have a conversation with a veterinary surgeon before we decide how to go about proceeding with this. And whilst there's no cause for alarm, we'd always recommend basic sensible hygiene precautions because there may be infections in wild animals that could cause ill health in people, such as salmonella infection. So not handling carcasses directly, washing your hands, and appropriate carcass storage advice. So we cover all of that before we decide on what to do next. So the examinations are conducted at the labs at at London Zoo, and we use all manner of different diagnostic tests as you would do with any species. And that's in an effort to make a diagnosis on cause of death, but also to detect any other concurrent infections or diseases that may be present. And whilst we're doing that, we take a lot of time and energy to collate samples. In fact, we have tens of thousands of frozen and fixed tissue specimens now on archive. And this is a unique and really important, I think, national resource, which enables us to do further dedicated study. It's important that we feed back these results, and that starts with feeding back to individual submitters. So obviously we let people know what we found in the examinations and highlight if there's any in particular implications or advice that we might offer for garden habitat management or information resources that relate to a diagnosis. So all of this disease surveillance information integrates with the BTO schemes for population monitoring that we've already been hearing about. And that means that we're in the really unusual position that we're able to bring this information together and try to evaluate whether a particular condition may be causing a population level decline. And then our goal is constantly to bring this information together and try to provide science-based guidance on the different conditions that occur. So on our website, we have a results page with a link to publications. We've published over 50 studies from this work to date, and wherever possible, we use open access journals. Almost all of the papers I'll mention today are in open access, so you can read them. But at the same time, we're careful where it's appropriate to translate that to press releases, to try to raise wider awareness, and these can sometimes generate quite a lot of media and public interest. On the website, we also have a mapping tool, and that means that you can take a look at what's happening perhaps in your region. These zoomed out screen grabs just give an indication of the extent of the coverage that we've been able to achieve since the website launched in 2013. We have a library of disease fact sheets at gardenwildlifehealth.org, and I'd encourage you to take a look at that. We've updated many of these during lockdown this year and added titles such as avian malaria. So these are useful resources which we update based on scientific findings, and we have social media channels which we use for disseminating, for raising awareness, but not for trying to capture information and reports. And we also, with the BTO's help, produce an electronic newsletter a couple of times a year. We are part of the Government Surveillance Partnership, and this is a group of different organisations, each of which take responsibility for leading on disease surveillance in different taxonomic groups. But we work together, we pool that information, and we produce a quarterly report that's published on the government's website each regularly. So that's again something that's available to everybody. So as Kate said, this year the decision to make GBW free of charge has been tremendous in terms of this year we've passed the threshold of over 10,000 people have helped contribute information to Garden Wildlife Health, which we're tremendously grateful for. Over 6,000 of them have done so on a regular basis. And that means during this really difficult year, we have been able to continue in many ways with our surveillance work. So thank you for that. So looking at the time, I'm going to quickly just give some examples of the kinds of things we found and try to put them in context. So the first has already been touched on. Probably our most significant finding is an emerging infectious disease that's caused population level decline. And I could talk for an hour, easy, on this topic alone, but this is parasitic disease, finch trichomonasis, causing epidemic mortality, in particular of green finches. And through a whole variety of studies, we've provided evidence to support that we think it's about a 70% UK breeding bird population decline mediated by this disease. So there you have evidence that disease can be an important and unpredictable factor influencing wild bird populations. And as Kate's already highlighted, the BTO's chaffinch appeal this year, the decline being more recent, chaffinches being the second most frequently affected species by finch trichomonasis. So we hope to be able to bring all of our information together and look at disease as one of a number of potential factors that might be influencing the chaffinch population. Disease is a welfare concern. Here's one example. This is a viral condition, a particular strain of avian pox that we think came in from mainland Europe into southeast England around 2006 and has now spread across the country well into Scotland, primarily affecting great tits, sometimes causing really quite severe skin lesions, which we know compromises individual bird health. We've also been able to find out more about endemic diseases. A good example here would be chaffinch foot lesions. Now, this is by far and away the most common thing that we have reported to us, caused by either a mite infestation or a chaffinch papillomavirus. But with the Garden Wildlife Health data, for the first time, we've been able to look nationally at the occurrence and the cause of this endemic, long-established, low-prevalence condition. Safeguarding public health. So passerine salmonellosis is a condition that we used to diagnose quite often, not so much in the past decade, but it's caused by very, very particular strains of Salmonella typhimurium bacteria. And when we work with the public health agencies, comparing the information that we have from garden birds and infections in people, we were able to conclude that there is evidence that garden birds may act as a source of Salmonella infection to people, but that these garden bird strains accounted for only 0.2%, a tiny proportion of those Salmonella infections. So it's important we're aware, we have basic hygiene, we wash our hands after feeding the birds, but there's no cause for alarm with that. So it's informed action for guidance. Novel causes of mortality. A very striking example of this is about a dozen incidents we've had of multiple, sometimes large numbers, typically juvenile starlings drowning in artificial water bodies, in swimming pools, in ponds, even in this case, very sadly, in a bucket. So we found no evidence of an underlying condition responsible for that. Seems most likely relating to flocking behaviour, but you can imagine that this can cause an awful lot of public concern when it occurs. We've worked with all manner of different groups. Something that you might have heard of this year in the spring were reports from NABU in Germany, where they were seeing, unfortunately, some epidemic mortality in blue tits. And their investigations highlighted that this bacterial infection, Salmonella ornithicola, may be responsible. Well, we were the first to identify this infection with our garden bird work in the 1990s, and we've done a handful of studies. And so we were able to share our experience with the scientists at NABU and the vets that they were working with. We looked carefully at all of our surveillance data, saw no signal that we were seeing a similar epidemic in blue tits in this country this spring. We used all of that information to update our fact sheet and shared it with our partners and government and when we had media queries. So we were able to use that surveillance information and share the lessons that we'd learned. Horizon scanning, we're always aware of problems that may be occurring elsewhere. So a good example of this would be Yasutu virus, which is a flavivirus spread by mosquitoes that has, over the past 2 decades, caused primarily blackbird mortality in countries in mainland Europe, sometimes captive owls also. So we have been on the lookout for it carefully, but only detected it for the first time this summer in a small number of blackbirds. And we are aware of, there's no evidence of disease in poultry. We're aware of a small number of cases of ill health in human in mainland Europe, mostly asymptomatic infection. But because of this, it's a real One Health approach where we're looking at working with different government authorities to make that information available update the information we have available on our website to highlight that we're now into winter, we're out of that mosquito active season, but looking forwards to the summer next year. There are many different conditions that can affect blackbirds, so it's very important not to jump to conclusions, but we will be vigilant and we'll be looking to see if there may be any further evidence of cases in the future, or if that perhaps does not occur. So that's our looking to the future. So I'm going to very quickly, I've got messages coming in, I'm just checking that everything's running okay. As Kate touched on, our goal is always to try and piece this information together and give guidance on best practice for feeding so we can maximise benefits but minimise risks. And if we think about birds, if they congregate at high density, if they have species mixing, if they feed at sustained intervals, or if there are poor hygiene precautions, all of those factors might mean an increased likelihood of a disease transmitting. And so in this paper, again, open access, we went into a lot of detail on ways that risk factors may be associated with food provision, and we distill that into advice on hygiene at feeding stations, provision of small amounts of a diverse range of foods that are fresh, with clean water, rotating feeding sites, all of these sensible measures that we can take to try and help avoid problems occurring. And in the event that we do spot a problem, to report to us so that we can try and make a diagnosis, understand the problem, how it transmits, the species that are susceptible. We don't advocate medication of free-living wildlife. So as Kate already mentioned, it may be necessary on a temporary basis to stop feeding, to disperse the birds and prevent new healthy birds being exposed in our garden habitat. So the last slides, I'm sure I'm about at time, just to highlight ways I think we might be able to go further with BTO to strengthen this work, perhaps by linking together with the ring recovery birds that are found dead. We really don't know much about the health conditions that, for example, affect farmland birds. So this would be a way of working together further in the future, and also working more with ringers, perhaps adding disease recording codes to the ringing website. And we could together learn a lot more about species that are really only observed by ringers. So in summary, if this has been interesting, I've just signpost you to an article we wrote that's available on the BTO website, one of the masterclass articles on disease in garden birds. And highlight 2 events, this is it, last slide, coming up on events that we actually have at ZSL, free to attend evening, but they're relevant because in the 12th of January, we have a talk on wildlife pathology where I'll be talking about snake fungal disease, and colleagues will be talking about stranded cetaceans or bird of prey investigations and the like. And then in February, Kate's very kindly joining us for an evening focused on citizen science and conservation. And to highlight that, will include a presentation by my colleague who will talk about this paper that relied on questionnaire surveys that BTO Garden Birdwatch has completed. This was all about why people want to get involved in citizen science. Not surprisingly, it was about environmental values and caring for wild animal welfare and conservation, but also very clearly it was about a desire to learn and gain knowledge. And that's why I think it's so important that we try and translate all of these findings into all of these different formats and make that information widely available. It's a team effort. We therefore have exchange of that information, and we can make the most impact from what we're able to learn together. So thanks to partners, thanks to loads of collaborators, of course, thanks to funders, but today in particular, thanks to garden birdwatchers, because we couldn't have learned all of this without your help. And I'm over 22 minutes, so I apologise. Thanks very much.
No apology necessary, Becki. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I'll jump in straight with some questions, if I may. So there's one from earlier, which was from Debbie Adams, who says she lives in Melton Mowbray, where there's some avian flu. Does it affect wild birds? And if so, are there any specific species that are more vulnerable to it than others?
Okay, so this looks a little bit like a fix, but I'm going to go to my next slide. So I thought a question might come on about avian flu. So I'd really direct everybody to an excellent resource on the DEFRA website. So yes, very long topic. I'll try and do Kate's version of a short answer. Avian influenza, there are many different strains. Typically, an infection of waterfowl can cause disease. In poultry, the strains vary. The recent media attention that you'll have heard about is H5N8 detection. Over the past month, there have been several hundred detections in poultry and wild birds in GB, but in many countries in mainland Europe. It's a lineage that was first seen, I think, in Iraq in the early summer. So I'd signpost you to the DEFRA website. In particular, you'll see here, they're interested in reports of the key, that species susceptibility, waterfowl, gulls, and birds of prey. So we're directing queries on when people find dead birds of those species to the DEFRA helpline. There's a lot of information available, and obviously if anybody has captive poultry or backyard waterfowl, whatever, there's also very valuable information there on biosecurity measures to be taken. So I hope that touches on some of the answer, but I direct you to the DEFRA website where there's lots of detail available.
Lovely, thanks, Becki. Another one then, this from Pete Edwards, who asks, how effective is regularly spraying bacterial sprays on feeders to reduce some diseases?
I can't really give you a sort of straightforward answer on the efficacy of that. What I would say is that I wouldn't advocate spraying chemicals onto feeders directly. That's what we would recommend, is on a regular basis taking the feeders down. So topping them up with food that's used quickly, and then on a regular basis taking them down, using rubber gloves and a bucket outside. Don't bring them into the kitchen sink. Clean the feeder, use detergent. Look on websites with Avery safe disinfectants. There's information on our website. Wash them, rinse them with clean water, air dry them, and then top them up and put them into reuse. Some people rotate between two feeders and use that system. But I personally wouldn't advocate putting chemicals next to where the animals are feeding. I'd separate it and make sure that you rinse any chemicals off and air dry before you put the feeder back into use.
Thanks, Becki. I guess this should be our last one because we're running out of time. Maybe you could stay on and answer some of the questions in the chat box afterwards. This one's from Steve Black on YouTube, who's asking, are we seeing more wildlife deaths in gardens? And if so, what are the main reasons for that?
It's very difficult to do this. So I think what we are doing is we are getting it's a combination of different things. Broadly speaking, there are patterns of and indicators of increasing frequencies of emergence events. But when I go back to that, I think we're getting much better at looking and understanding what's going on. And the point that I try to make is that putting finding in context. So sometimes things are new to us, but not new to the wild animals that we're working with. So it's really important for us to try to recognize whether it's new to us, it's emerging in the wild animals, is it stable or not, and what are the factors? So I would have to have a longer conversation offline, but what I'd say is I think we're putting systems in place to be much better with garden wildlife, at least to be able to understand the health conditions, which is part of what we need to do, and that we always need to try to put those findings in context. And that's why working with BTO, when we can understand the species ecology, the movement, the migration, the population trends, that's the way that we can capitalize on the information that we have to hand to start to answer that question. So it's a bit of a fudge, but please do, on our website, we've got an email, Garden Wildlife Health email, so you can contact us via that with specific queries.
Thanks so much, Becki. That was great.
All right, thank you very much, everybody. And I hope the final talk, I'm sure it's excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We're going to go across the Atlantic now to our final talk, where Benjamin Van Doren is waiting for us. Benjamin's doing a postdoc at the Lab of Ornithology in Ithaca, New York, and he's going to tell us about tracking Britain's wintering blackcaps. Over to you, Benjamin. Welcome.
Thank you. Does that look all right, screen-wise?
That's good, Benjamin.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you all for having me. I'm looking forward to talking with you today. So this work that I'm going to discuss is a huge collaborative effort that would not have been possible without so many people around the world, including garden birdwatchers in Britain, ringers in Britain and Ireland, and many others. So thanks to all of them. I am a scientist, and I study bird migration, and I'm particularly interested in studying changes in migration in action in the wild. And there are two ways that we can do this. One is to look at examples of recent and rapid changes in migration. For example, on this slide, we see a white stork in a garbage dump in Spain. And these birds have been migrating shorter distances, not always going to Africa because of this new food supply. And another example are migratory divides, or zones of contact between populations with different migratory strategies, where it can be really informative to look at the push and pull of those different strategies where the populations meet. For now, I'll focus on the first example and looking at blackcaps, abundant breeding birds across Europe. And what makes blackcaps particularly interesting for this kind of work is that they show a variety and abundance of different migratory strategies, and that their migration behavior is inherited. And we know this from, at least to a large extent. So we know this from early experiments in the 90s that showed that blackcaps from Western Europe in autumn migrate southwest, and those in Eastern Europe migrate southeast, and they show this behavior even when brought into the lab. And when this was done in the lab, the two populations with those differing migratory directions, when they were crossbred, their offspring showed an intermediate direction. This is a message about the video. Let me know if there's an issue with the video. I'll keep talking for now. So the offspring go in intermediate directions, providing some of the first evidence that that migration in birds is genetically inherited, at least migratory direction. And blackcaps also have shown recent changes in their behavior. Since the 1960s, especially in Britain and Ireland, they've been increasing in number in the winter. And lab experiments again confirmed that this is an inherited behavior. But there's an open question, or many open questions, one being where these birds are coming from. Are they coming from Central Europe, where that migratory divide between East and West migrants exists, or are they staying all year round in the UK, or are they coming from elsewhere? This remains to be determined. Another aspect of blackcap biology is that they've been increasing in recent decades. The populations across Europe have gone up 150% since 1980. And this is really unusual for a migratory bird, which in large part we see migratory species in decline now. So blackcaps might contain an important lesson about resilience to these kinds of global changes. But despite all these interesting aspects of blackcap biology, they've never been extensively tracked in the wild. So that's what we set out to do with this project. Again, with a huge range of collaborators, including Greg Conway at the BTO, many collaborators in continental Europe, and so many not pictured here who helped out as garden bird watchers, resighting birds, ringing birds, and I'll talk about that in a little later. So huge team effort. Going back to the mid 20th century, blackcaps around that time were relatively rare in the UK in winter. Here's an example from a county bird report, Cornwall in 1947, where an undoubted blackcap feeding outside the dining room window was remarkable. In addition, in Worcestershire in 1955, 4 in one area was remarkable. In Devon, still in 1958, individual birds were notable. But by the late 1970s, blackcaps were well established as a wintering bird in the UK, with a survey documenting over 1,700. And we can see from county bird reports this increase over time in a number of different counties, especially through the 70s and 80s increases in blackcaps that were quite dramatic in the winter. So clearly there's been a rapid and dramatic change in Britain, at least in this time. So as I mentioned, migration seems to be both inherited yet able to change rapidly. And this, to me, is a really interesting paradox of bird migration. And it's something we wanted to investigate further in blackcaps. So I set out to catch them in the UK in gardens, and thankfully we could make use of their preference for garden feeders. So here's a male blackcap feeding on a fat mixture provided by Glyn Evans in Hampshire. This bird is coloring, as you might see. So the fact that they were so tied to food sources in gardens made it possible to catch them with a little bit of ingenuity. So here's just another example to give you a sense for blackcaps in gardens. This is a male defending its favored feeder. And when another bird flies in, just then this bird goes off to chase it away immediately. So they can be quite aggressive in the winter, especially when it gets colder. Sorry, there we go. So it took a bit of work to figure out the best way to catch these birds, but Graham Roberts in Portsmouth has figured out an excellent approach to catching these birds using cage straps baited with food. So you just saw a video of I'll play it again, a female blackcap feeding within a cage trap from some cake provided. And on the right, there's me inside with a scope looking out at the feeder, ready to press a remote control to drop the door to catch the bird if I wanted to. So I would sit, wait, watch the traps and trigger them when I wanted to catch particular individuals, which was a cozy bit of field work, but required constant vigilance as well. But hopefully at the end of it, I would end up with a blackcap in the hand, and all would be well. So once we caught these birds, and with the help of ringers across the British Isles, we color-ringed over 600 blackcaps in recent years, each with a unique combination of 3 colors and a metal ring. So look out for these birds in your own gardens, because we did get reports of actually quite a few movements where blackcaps showed up in gardens that they had not been ringed in. So there could be coloring blackcaps lurking around your garden if you look closely. So we coloring them to monitor their behavior, to learn about their movements, and took lots of measurements looking at bill and wing shape, relating them to aspects of their biology. And the questions we focused on were numerous, but I'll focus on a few here. One, as I mentioned before, is where are these wintering blackcaps coming from, and are some resident all year round in the UK? What advantages do they gain from wintering in the UK, this new behavior? And thinking about this more deeply, could differences potentially in migration timing when they return to their breeding area in spring, for example, if wintering birds in the UK return to the breeding grounds earlier than those coming from elsewhere, that could lead to assortative mating, with those birds choosing mates that have similar migratory behavior. So we wondered if that could be happening. And to track these birds, we used light level geolocators, which are devices weighing about ½ a gram. There's this one on the back of a male blackcap. They contain a clock, a battery, and a light sensor, essentially. And they determine location from the pattern of daylight, which is quite clever and also quite lightweight. But the challenge is that one has to recatch the bird physically after it has completed its migration in order to figure out where it has gone. And so that posed the greatest challenge of our effort, is to recatch the birds after they had returned. This is what the devices look like on a bird in the hand, and in the field when the feathers have been preened over it with the light sensor, that plastic little tube sticking out as designed above the feathers. Now I want to give you a sense for what the field work could be like, especially when we had an exciting event. So this is a particularly special blackcap. Red, metal yellow are the colors. And this bird I ringed with Stuart Brown in the Malvern Hills area south of Worcester in one winter, I forget the year. And then the next winter, it was seen by someone about 30 kilometers away, Robin Lisboon in Gloucester. And this was not a place we had tagged any blackcaps. We were just really lucky to get word of this bird hanging out in their garden. So because it was carrying a geolocator, I sprung into action and went over to check out the situation. Here's me in their living room looking at the feeders outside, back when we could visit other people. And here's the bird that has come in to investigate the trap that I've set around the suet feeder that it had been favoring. And blackcaps, I want to give you a sense for what they're like in the garden, because they are very wary birds. If you disrupt anything that they aren't, anything that they're used to, if you disrupt it or change it, they tend to be very cautious and often are put off. So I knew it was risky, and the temperatures were warming, meaning they would have less of a reason to need the supplemental food. And so I thought this might be my only chance to actually catch this bird. As you can see, it's perched tantalizingly close to this feeder with the cage trap around it, but not quite going in. And you can imagine me as the scientist, the biologist, looking at all this valuable data from a year's worth of travels, so close and yet so far. It's definitely a stressful moment. And I'll skip ahead a bit because this bird sits around and spends some time investigating and doesn't really go in. But I put this twig on the outside of the cage to try and entice it to go in a bit more comfortably, and so it does. But I'm sitting there with the remote control, and I can't fire it too soon, otherwise the bird won't be caught. So I have to wait and judge that it's in far enough. So that's, again, very, very stressful, as you can imagine. And so I'm trying to determine if it's close enough, and I am able to catch it. So that was a success, and it turned out this bird contains some very interesting information. So that was a real treat to have. So moving on to where the blackcaps actually come from. So as you may remember from earlier in the talk, one hypothesis is that these birds are coming from the migratory divide area in Central Europe, where the southwest and southeast directions meet. And we did find that some birds indeed came from this area, but many, if not most of the birds actually came from further west. So these are the breeding season summer points for the birds we tagged with geolocators, and about half of them come from France, a few further east than the migratory divide zone as well, but for the most part further west, with the occasional really interesting recovery or track from Spain, where these birds migrating essentially due north in autumn, and even more remarkably, coming from an area that is quite close to the normal wintering range of this bird. Most of the blackcaps tend to winter around the Mediterranean. So the fact that these birds were so close and yet still flew north to the UK is fascinating, and probably speaks to, among other things, the contribution of their genetically programmed behavior to their migration. How else to explain this counterintuitive behavior? So another fascinating aspect of our results is that the span of locations that the birds come from is so large. It's about 2,000 kilometers across Europe, which is not what we were expecting given the initial predictions of birds coming from, say, a concentrated area in the migratory divide zone of Central Europe. So this was surprising and really interesting as well. And I want to highlight one bird that we didn't put a geolocator on, but solely by virtue of it having been ringed with color rings, we have actually a really remarkable amount of information about this bird. So this is a bird that was color ringed in Glyn, Evans Garden, in Hampshire, and then in June, 1 or 2 years later, it was caught by a ringer in northern Germany during the breeding season. So presumably this bird is breeding in northern Germany, and there are its colorings photographed by the ringer in Germany. And not only this, but this bird was sighted again another winter in Swindon, again photographed. So we have information about 2 wintering sites and a breeding site from this bird only because it was color ringed and not because it was carrying any fancy tracking device. So this speaks to the amount we can learn about birds by being observant, looking out for marked individuals. And I'd encourage you again to look out in your own gardens for possible color-ringed blackcaps. Moving on, we looked at the timing again of movements. So this plot shows on the x-axis how different the British wintering blackcaps were in their timing compared to other blackcaps migrating south. And the negative values indicate that their timing was earlier. And in the spring migration, this bottom panel, we find that blackcaps wintering in the UK migrated back to the breeding grounds about 10 days earlier than their Mediterranean wintering counterparts, which fits with our hypothesis that if these birds arrive earlier to the breeding grounds, they may be more likely to mate with other UK wintering birds, thereby passing on those northwards migratory genes to their offspring. This was accomplished by primarily short migrations. So in black, these birds migrating north to the UK had the shortest migrations compared to other birds we tracked migrating south from Central Europe. So they're close to the breeding grounds, they have fast migrations, and they migrate a bit earlier. Summarizing, we find that blackcaps wintering in the UK originate from a vast area across continental Europe with few or no birds spending all year round in the UK. We find that they arrive earlier on the breeding grounds in spring, but it's still unclear whether this is enough to really cause or enforce this kind of assortative mating between British wintering birds. And it's also unclear what might maintain this behavior across such a large area, especially if it's genetically controlled. So that's something we're looking into now, is to try and link genetics with these migratory behaviors we actually observed in the wild. Lastly, I will show you a tidbit of some parallel research from the team in continental Europe focused on the migratory divide in Austria, in case you're interested. So here's Austria in the center, and each arrow, whether gray and dotted or solid, shows a blackcap representing either a geolocator track or a ringing recovery. And what I want to point out is that west of the migratory divide shown in red, all of the blackcaps are migrating towards the southwest. And then east of the migratory divide, as expected, most of them are migrating southeast. But the interesting thing is that in the zone in the middle, which where we tracked a lot of birds, we found that there's a very sharp and rapid change from southwest to southeast. So on the x-axis here is the direction. So westerly transitions very sharply to southeasterly across a gradient from west to east. So this is really interesting and suggests that there's some fascinating evolutionary dynamics happening in this area with their migratory direction. If you want to read more about our work, you can visit the URL above to see the published research. And if you have any coloring blackcap sightings, please submit them to the BTO. You can submit them directly to us at blackcap@bto.org. And again, I need to thank just the really large amount of people who helped make this project possible, including many not listed here. So thanks for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks very much, Benjamin. That was fascinating. We've got loads of questions for you. I'm going to start by combining two, I think. The first is from John Scott, Lucky John Scott, I think we should call him, who says that in 3 winters, he's had 50 plus blackcaps visiting his garden, but only one was a female. And similarly, Kay Eccleston, who is in St. Austell in Cornwall, has had a female blackcap regularly, but has never seen a male. Can you tell us something about that?
Yes, that's really interesting. And that ratio of estimated 50 with only one female, that's something I've rarely encountered. We definitely see variation from year to year and site to site in males and females and in the sex ratio. Across our study, we coloringed approximately half males and half females. So we don't find strong evidence for an overall bias in the sex ratio across the population, but it is possible that in certain areas, I'm not sure where both of those people are located, but it's possible that in different parts of Britain, potentially depending on how harsh the winters are, that the sex ratios may differ. For example, maybe more males further north. That's not something I'm sure about, because we focused on in the south, but that's one possibility. So I'd be very interested to talk with both of them further afterwards.
Thanks, Benjamin. And a question from Steve Black on YouTube, who says he gets blackcaps in the summer and the winter. What winter food will they take? He says they don't come to his feeders. So
they in the winter, primarily they seem to enjoy high energy fatty foods like fat balls, suet. Cake sometimes. I encountered someone feeding successfully croissants. So a wide range of kind of sugary fatty foods they seem to like, gets them through the winter. But many individuals also will prefer seeds. I've seen individuals really like sunflower seeds, so there's some variation there. And apples especially, they love apples.
Lovely. And a question from John Morgan. He's asking, is there any difference in the beak structure or wing shape, primary feather length, that kind of plumage between the UK wintering blackcaps and the UK breeding birds?
That's a great question. I'm actually actively looking into that now. I don't have a solid answer yet, but I can say that there has been a study this was about now a decade ago from Europe that found some differences in morphology and wing and bill shape between birds that they determined were going north to the UK versus south. So there are some inklings of that, but we don't have solid results on that yet from our study.
Great, thank you. Well, I said we would finish by 3:30, so I think we better leave it there. Benjamin, if you've got time to pop into the Q&A section and answer some more of the questions, we'd really appreciate it. But for now, I'm going to say thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you.
So I'd like to thank Kate, Becki and Benjamin for their fascinating contributions. I hope you've all enjoyed it, and thank you all for giving up your time to participate. I don't know if Benjamin could hear it, but I'm pretty sure that when that blackcap went into the trap, there was a loud cheer from the audience. There certainly would have been if we'd been in the room together, I think. As I mentioned at the start, now more than ever, our research relies on the support of you, our members and supporters, because of the impact of the pandemic. There are many ways to support us, and many of you already do great things for us, not least contributing to Garden Birdwatch and sending in ring sightings for us. But the best way to help us now is by donating to our work, and you can do so by following the link on the screen here. I hope you're going to be able to join us for more talks during the week. The next session is tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, when my colleague Simon Gillings is going to be joining us. He'll be telling us about the fascinating discoveries you can make by using acoustic monitoring to find out what's flying over your home at night. I'm sure it's going to be a really interesting evening. So until then, or until next time, thank you so much again for joining us, and goodbye.